All right. So here's an interesting thought, or at least a thought that I thought was interesting. Whether you do or not kind of remains to be seen. But we got young Jack Nicklaus on the left, and we got Rory McIlroy on the right. Okay. What I was thinking about was eye dominance. Okay. So if we draw some lines here and we start to look at the different ball positions, the different head positions that these two players set up with, okay? Now, Jack Nicklaus, from what I've heard and studied, if you will, was a left eye dominant, right-handed person. And so we can see that his head is tilted way to the back, okay? Way more than Rory's is. Now, one could argue that maybe the camera angle is a little bit different, and it's very possible that's the case. Rory's, to me, looks more straight on, whereas Jack's look like we're a little bit back of center, left of center in the view of the camera, but pretty close. Jack's ball position looks way more forward. But you can see, if what we are saying is true, or what I was saying is true, is that Jack is a left-eye dominant person, okay? I've heard that a lot. It's not like I just heard it one time. So we can see that Jack is looking at the ball like this. He's looking at the ball much more sideways, right? Now, if we make the assumption, and I think it's a safe assumption because most right-handed people are right-eye dominant, okay, that Rory is right-eye dominant, and so he's looking at the ball more like this, okay? And that's not really the best line, right? I mean, we really have to zoom in on their eyes and try to figure that out. But the idea is, at least this is the thing that's been sort of kicking around in my head, is that this is much more straight. Okay, now, with the driver, right, we're always going to have that golf ball farther this way, up in our stance, right? But you can see, again, it could be camera angle, and that certainly could be the case, but you can see that Rory's got a much more central ball position than Jack did. Now, again, I've studied Jack Nicklaus and his writings, and my first golf book was the Jack Nicklaus Golf My Way, the big picture book, illustrated picture book. And Jack talked about the fact that he tried to swing slightly out to in to cut the ball, to fade the ball, right? Well, the farther forward in your stance that you put the driver, or any club, but in particular the driver, the farther across the line we're going to be, because our center line, right? Our center line is kind of what dictates, that's not very good. Our center line is kind of what dictates where our low point is with our driver. So we can see that this is going to be an ascending shot, especially with Jack, because you can just kind of tell he's tilted down to the right. You can see his hands are a little bit behind the ball. Rory's hands are a touch behind the ball, so is his club. He's got a little, not fully Mo Norman, but a little Mo Norman thought, right? And he tees it much higher. Obviously, some of that is the size of the driver. But Rory's trying to launch this thing, okay? So as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about my own game, and I'm thinking about the fact that sort of anecdotally, I go out, I have a net and a putting green and such in my backyard. I go outside and I go to hit some balls, and the first few I've noticed that I'm hitting them behind the ball. I'm hitting it fat. And we just had some rain, and so the mat, you can see the marks on there, and I can feel it, obviously, just a little bit heavy, not, right? And so I started looking at my own game sort of through a lens of the past and the current times, and feeling like that there's a convention that we have about where the ball needs to be situated, when the reality of the convention is it needs to be situated wherever your low point is. And I'm talking about with an iron now, right? And wherever your low point is needs to be behind the ball with your driver, because we're going to swing up on it, especially today, in today's environment with today's technology, right? But even back when Jack Nicklaus played, that ball's teed up and he's going to launch it. And Jack was a great driver of the golf ball, certainly one of the longest players of his time, just like Rory, right? So the iron and the driver are very, very different, right? They're on opposite ends of the spectrum. So what I think is important to think about in terms of where does that ball go is where is our low point? And then to carry that like sort of up a level, more of an overall philosophy on low point, I think that low point has to be dictated in large part by our dominant eye, because we have binocular vision and we are binocular hunters, targeters. The things out in front of us, we use our eyes, both eyes. And I would be willing to bet that if you were, mapping small movements of people's heads and eyes in terms of throwing darts or just turning and looking at something, there's a bias there every single time in which the eye, the head, turns to best align the dominant eye with the thing that we're striking, right? And so then it becomes drill it back down and go, well, are we striking the ground or are we striking the ball? Well, the answer is both, really. We are positioning the golf ball with an iron shot to the other side, away from the target, right for a right-hander, left for a left-hander, of low point, because we want to strike the ball first. How much? Depends on the angle of attack. Depends on the club that you're hitting, right? But you can look and see and measure that low point sometimes is 3.5 inches target side of the golf ball with a steeper shot like a wedge, right? And so this kind of is kind of sidebars into impugning mats, although I use the mat to my benefit for this. This is also kind of what I was getting at from a practical side of what are we going to do. How are we going to facilitate this? And what's the practical things that we need to start doing? Well, mats, in my opinion, cause some problems, but they are useful because it allows you to really zero in on low point, especially when they get a little wet. So you can see that watermark. There's some teaching aids out there. I've seen one that I think is really cool. I've never used it, but it brushes up and you can just brush it back. And so you can really see where your low point is. You can really see your divots. It's pretty brilliant. But what we really want to understand is that we can try to do things that adjust low point, right? There are technique things, there are setup things, grip even, that can affect the low point of the golf club. But low point is what low point is. And when you're going to the golf course, for certain, you want to find your low point and put the ball there, respectively, right? So if you know where your low point is with your driver, then the golf ball has to be on the target side of that if you're going to swing up on it. Just simple geometry, right? So I know I struggle with that. And I know that I struggle with the fact that I go out and I put the golf ball in a conventional spot, which is this far inside of my left heel or something like that. Why? Well, because that's what Jack Nicklaus did and that's what Ben Hogan did. Well, the problem is that my optics are 6 inches on the, 5 inches on the other side of zero. If zero is, say, your nose, then I'm on the other side of that. I'm on the other side and I have to do things differently. And so then we go to a guy like a Lee Trevino, who, if you listen to one of Lee's comments about his little dance, right? And if anybody's ever studied Lee Trevino, he had a very unique, almost frenetic and sometimes shuffling of his feet. And he would never really stand still, and he would do this little step, drop, step, and then would go and hit the ball. And obviously Lee Trevino is one of the greatest ball strikers of all time. So there's something to be said for that. And when he was asked about it, he was talking about it never looked right to him. It never looked correct. If he looked down at the ball and then looked back at the target, when he came back to look at the ball, it never looked correct to him. And so he would look at the target, and then once he looked down at the ball, he would never look back at the target. And then he would do this little dance and shuffle his feet, which if you watch, he kind of steps and moves the ball back in his stance to his right. He's a right-hander. And then opens his stance in his eyes. He moves his left side back away from the ball. Okay? And I'm sure he had different machinations for different shots. He probably worked that into his routine and the way he did things so that he could effectuate path and angle of attack. And so I'm standing there looking at myself and thinking, man, I'm asking students of mine to get rid of convention, and then I catch myself being so conventional, right? And it's not that conventional is wrong, it's just not right for every person. And I think there's maybe a better way to determine where that is, right? Which is first find low point and then look down at it. And for me, the ball is back. It is to the right. Now, I am a very right-eye dominant person, right? I'd be willing to bet, however that's measured in terms of, I'm sure that the eye doctors can tell you how much, right? But I know that I'm quite right-eye dominant in terms of my prescriptions and all that. And I have glasses and contacts, so it's something that I know exists in my vision. Well, that would make sense then, right? It would make sense that my ball position would be right of 0. If I were just standing straight without tilting my shoulders and just my eyes are level, my shoulders are level, and I'm looking out in front of me, where's my 0 line? Where's the dead center of my body? Now, there's all kinds of golf geek arguments about whether that is truly the center of the golf swing, because we're leaning over to put our bottom hand on and those kind of things, right? But the reality of the situation is that if I were just standing and looking at something and trying to target it, if I had to take a dart and throw it at the golf ball, I'd be willing to bet that over time there would be a slight shift in my body to align my right eye with exactly on the ball where I'm trying to throw it, okay? I don't think that's too much of a stretch, whether it's shooting a rifle, throwing a dart, shooting a pool cue, right? We're always going to try to align our dominant eye in certain ways, okay? So it seems logical to me that in golf we would do that. And then I have the practical knowledge mostly from myself, but also from my students. And I say mostly from myself is that sometimes it's something you overlook and you don't really ask people, right? Or I don't really ask people. And I've started to be far more focused on the optics at looking down and how all that relates, and then how it all relates to D-plane. Because if you can't perceive what is what very well, then you're always going to be, a little off, right? And so if you think you're aligned, this is the classic. Hey, like, Johnny, stand behind me and tell me where I'm lined up. Well, what difference does it make where you're lined up? What it makes is where you think you're lined up, right? And so, yeah, I don't feel that. It feels like I'm over here. Okay, well, clearly we've got a disconnect between those two. Now, if you kept hitting the ball in the correct spot, but you said, I feel like I'm lined up way over here, and you'll hear that in lessons where people are working on alignment, right? And there's always the classic conventional way with the clubs and all of that. And I've sort of gotten away from that. I've dropped that as a useful measure, the railroad tracks, because I think it hems us in, right? It hems us in when we are trying to align a biomechanical machine, right? A biomechanical device that is going to move through space and time and have hinges and levers and produce certain geometry. I'm not saying that there aren't people that can play pure railroad tracks and that works well for them. I just feel like it is a limiting factor. And then obviously you can't get very far from the railroad tracks to then ball position, right? And so again, the more that I think about it, the more that I realize that well, low point is always generally going to be, to me, it would seem, is going to be before or at center line, at zero line, if that's the center of our body. And that would be an interesting little study to see. And then it would stand to reason that within that range, away from the target, to the right for a right-hander, left for a left-hander, within that range, based upon where your eyes are, where your main optic is, would dictate what you want to see and how you see it. So again, if we're binocular creatures and we're using binocular vision to target something, it stands to reason that over time we're just going to shift to get this targeted. And somebody says, well, why is your head tipped that way when you look at the golf ball, when you set up? And I go, well, because my right eye is way over here. And if the ball's up in my stance, I've got to drop my right side down so I can kind of look under to the golf ball. If I stay up very straight, I got to look and move just my eyes. And I don't know about you guys, but that's odd to me. It feels weird. I don't really feel like I'm actually looking at the thing that I'm trying to hit. And we can have a debate about, am I hitting at the golf ball or this or that? Fine. I agree. We don't want to swing at the ball necessarily in the classic sense of that sort of golf euphemism. Don't swing at the ball, swing through it, right? But if I don't have it all aligned properly, if I'm trying to make a cut with a saw and all the alignments are off, then the product is going to be off. And then this gets us back into grip and offset and all kinds of other little tangents, branches coming off the main tree. But man, if we could think about our eye as, I got to line everything up with that, right? Forget about where it is between my feet. Forget about where it is, where my feet are pointing. First, I've got to get this striking implement, that ball, and the ground lined up together in three-dimensional space, kind of in a two-dimensional view, though, to get this so that I strike this golf ball first. Right? Now, you're always going to strike the golf ball. Well, hopefully, you're going to strike the golf ball first. And when you're hitting a driver, a properly struck driver, you don't hit the ground at all. Right? So, but we still have to establish low point, because that allows us to decide where we're going to put the golf ball so we can sweep it off the peg. And we know we hit it the farthest when we sweep it off the peg. And we know we hit it the farthest when we swing down on it with an iron. If you start, really hitting 0 degrees with an iron, you can hit it well, but it has this sort of spinny, powder puffy kind of feel. Whereas when you really compress an iron swing, really smash it, that's when you get the most out of your irons. So we know those are two opposite ends of the spectrum, but it's the same optics from aiming the whole thing, coming down the line. It's like, how do we get this all lined up? So just kind of a thought, just kind of a random thing that sort of ties in. And I kind of had a way that I started looking at it. So I was standing in front of a mirror, and I just took a golf setup, no ball, just, in front of me, lined it up on a piece of the board on my floor in the house. And then once I got kind of lined up, without really, being overly concerned about alignment, I just picked up the club and used it like a plumb bob right underneath my right eye. And I saw on the little line on the slat on the floor where I had been lined up, and my eye was where I had the club. My eye was to the right of that, which means that ball position is, say, forward, right? It's more targetward than where my eye is. But that was what looked normal to me. I had a 6-iron, so that's what looked normal to me for a 6-iron. So then I held the plumb bob there, and I kept looking in the mirror, and this time I laid another club down on that line that went vertical, that went between my feet, just as for reference. I set the club down, and then I held the plumb bob again up underneath my eye, and I let it swing, and I got to where it was swinging directly over that shaft that was laying on the ground. Then I looked up, and then I looked at my ball position in relation to my feet, and it was back. Interesting. Of course it's going to be back, right? Again, I'm on the, in my opinion, and this is just sort of I'm on the right side of the scale, right? And so then the left side of the scale would be right-handed people who are left eye dominant. And so if you took that whole distance and you shifted that line where they set that club and where their eye is 5 inches to the left, what would that look like? That's a pretty big change. I mean, very big change, actually, when you think about the center line of your arc and all that, and that zero line and where our target lines, all the geometry, that's a big shift. So that person would have that classic, I play it off the inside of my left heel maybe, because that is where they align to. That's where they swing around to, right? But that's also part of why I think a lot of people really struggle hitting their driver very well, because their low point is so far around to the left that for a right-hander to get the club path to be more to the right to try to hit a draw or not fade it so much is tough, because now they're going away from it as well, right? So now they're like dropping their right side back, and their left eye is not as lined up with where the ball is. But I actually think the easiest thing to do for the driver for people is to show them that I want you to line up your dominant eye with the low point, and then just move the ball forward of that and understand that we're already arcing around, so we zero out that vector a little bit and we hit it much straighter and even drawing it. So the idea to me is that we have a natural reference point. We have a zero line. We have our optics. We know where our optics are aligned. And it never changes. So you don't wake up one morning and the distance between your eyes is dramatically changed due to the humidity, say, or lack. If you go up to elevation and play in Colorado and your eye has moved an inch over to the right and now your low point's messed up. It's always the same. And so we do it to ourselves, right? And we do it to ourselves with convention. And so one of the things that I've enjoyed when students tell me is that they often say that it's not that I necessarily add things to their swing. In fact, I take things away, but I give them permission to do things. They'll ask me a question and I'll say, yeah, I don't mind that at all. And a lot of this comes in with backswing, where, I mean, I don't care what you do on your backswing, frankly. I mean, there's a few things that maybe we'll talk about, and there's a few ideas but I think everybody's backswing has to be their own. Because if you're trying to manufacture a backswing that isn't your own, you've already lost, because now you're never going to have that athletic flow. You're never going to have, and then that would go directly into the eyes, right? A big trunk of that tree, a big branch off that tree is the fact of, where are my eyes aligned? What am I looking at? How does my whole body being, alignment athlete figure out what it is that I'm trying to do? And do I see this geometry on the ground, and can I replicate it consistently? And if the fundamental aspect of it, which is where's the low point in this arc, and where's the thing that I'm going to hit, is askew because we've set up to a convention, not to where our anatomy is, to our eyes, then, we're kind of doomed to be making bad cuts, if that makes sense. If this is a saw, Why are my cuts always a little misaligned? Well, because your blade isn't lined up right, and your optics, when you lined up that laser to get it all lined up right, it was askew. Or why are my rifle shots always a little bit this way? Well, it's because your optics are. You need to take some mils off of that scope. That seems very logical to me. Again, I want to do some testing on it. I need to ask a few more questions, but chime in. Tell me if this is something that you guys have ever experienced, and if it's anything that maybe you could go and play around with. A lot of the country right now, I know the weather is not so great, so this is a decent thing to do inside the house, in front of a mirror, and just start looking and saying, well, what would happen if I lined up exactly with that golf ball lined up with my dominant eye? And I don't know because I haven't really studied all of it, but there might be people that don't have dominant eyes. They're 50-50. I'd be willing to bet that that's one of the smaller percentages. And then there's obviously people who only have one eye and they are only able to target with that one eye. So, or they're blind in that eye, right? The other eye. So, but I know for myself, like I said, that I'm very right eye dominant. So, yeah, just a thought. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah. Hope everybody's doing well. Holler at me. Let me know if you have any thoughts.